Please welcome the panel on Climate Outcomes 2035, New Pathways to Accelerate Capital Deployment for Net Zero and Nature. Moderated by Senior Director of MI Finance at the Milken Institute, Dan Carroll.
Hello, everyone. Very excited to have a great discussion today about what the next decade looks like in terms of climate capital deployment. As many folks know, we're not quite doing as well as we would like on the 2030 midterm targets under the Paris Agreement. The consequences of climate change are happening right now. And at the same time, current strategies to deploy capital is experiencing mixed success. And then we're going to discuss some of that. There's also a weird kind of zone of paradox going on right now where power demand is up. In some areas, oil demand is up, but EV deployment and other clean energy success is happening at the same time. So it's interesting churn. We have an incredible group of people here today to help us figure out what we should be emphasizing and doing over the next decade. And so what I want to do first is I'm going to begin actually. I should also point out there will be plenty of time for questions. There's a QR code that will occasionally show up behind here, so make sure that people can come in on that. Just quickly down the line, I'll start the conversation in a second. Mark Galagli with Three Cairns, Dean Amber Miller from the USC School of Arts and Letters, Hiram Mazzano from Good Steward and various other great spots, Helen Mountford, CEO of ClimateWorks, and Adam Wang Levine from the U.S. Treasury Department. I'm going to go to Helen first to do a little bit of level setting. Helen, how are we doing? What's good? What's bad? Kind of just level set a little bit for us.
Thanks very much, Dan. I mean, I think we actually have to hold two truths in hand as we think about the climate crisis right now. On the one hand, as you said, we are seeing the devastating impacts of climate around the world, and obviously hitting the most vulnerable, the poorest countries, the communities that are most vulnerable to these impacts are really being devastated. But everywhere we're seeing wildfires, increasing heat events, storms, losing lives, losing livelihoods and communities and infrastructure. So we're seeing that happening, and we know we are not yet on track for where we need to be in climate, on track for a pathway to keeping global average temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The other truth is we're making incredible progress. So we're not yet on track. We're not where we need to be. But when I started working on climate, we were aiming for something like 4 to 6 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, today, with what we have in policies in governments around the world, what's already committed in policies, we'd be on 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. If you include what's been committed, not just what's already enacted in policies, but committed by governments or by the business sector, we're closer to 1.7 degrees Celsius. These are all a lot of numbers I'm throwing at you, but every fraction of a degree really matters here on climate. So we have been bringing it down. We're seeing incredible dynamism in some of the sectors that really matter. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, battery storage, even deforestation. In the first 6 months of his presidency, President Lula brought down deforestation in the Amazon by 34%. We need to do more. But it's going. On electric vehicles, just one example from some of our work, we've been convening and working with folks in India, China, US, and European Union on electric vehicle deployment. These are the 4 big markets, 4 big areas where you get production of vehicles. When we first started, we set a target that everyone said was going to be impossible to meet by 2026 to try and get 15% of each of those regions, the new car market, to be electric vehicles. Everyone said that's going to be too hard, not going to happen. It happened in 2022. So now we're going to the rest of the world. So there's some elements which are going so quick and so exciting, and we know we're nowhere near where we need to be. But there's some hope there too, and we got to keep trying.
I'm thinking of the eddy when you go rafting, where there's an interesting swirl going on. Mark, I wanted to go to you next, co-founder of Centerbridge Capital, economic PRAP advisor for President Obama, and climate advisor to John Kerry. You're doing some interesting stuff with Three Cairns, and as we kind of move both population and leadership to the global south, thinking about how to make those partnerships work in new way and really be listening to what those populations need. Can you share some of the three cairns, maybe a cairn or two?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. There are a lot of people in the room who know more about, let's call it the global south, than I do. I've been an investor for the last 35 years, mostly in the North American market, in Europe, and in certain parts of Asia. But for the last 3 years, I've spent all my time focused on climate in the southern hemisphere. And the questions that come to mind there are just try to right-size the equation. Right now, it looks like we need about $2.5 trillion more than we're currently investing per year.
Yeah.
$2.5 trillion per year. Let's put that in context. The IFC, which is the private sector portion of the World Bank, this year will invest $1.8 billion of equity. The entire World Bank group, the entire group, will invest around $33 billion. This is $2.5 trillion. The global economy is a little over $100 trillion. I think Helen, who I've learned a lot from over the years, knows a lot more about climate than I do. The thing that I feel like I know a lot about is numbers and finance.
Yeah.
We are so off track, it's breathtaking. We are off track. It's breathtaking. If you go to India, which I was there 2 weeks ago for a week of climate meetings, Prime Minister Modi's campaign slogan says, what does it say? I guarantee development. I guarantee it. He's likely to win big, and his people want development.
Yeah.
Right now, 2.5 years ago, the Indians would have said, we'll keep around 217 gigs of coal, 217 gigs flat line. Over the last 2.5 years, they're building now 20 gigs. They have on the drawing board a total of 82 gigs. If you go to Indonesia, they agreed years ago, no new coal, no beyond what they already had. But that was no new coal on grid. There's off-grid for things like smelting of nickel. So right now the Indian government, because of economic vitality, I'm not criticizing the Indian government, nor am I criticizing the Indonesian government in what I'm talking about around nickel, they'll build about 22 gigs of coal to fire power, coal to fire smelters. So the scale of this is just very, very hard to understand. What do we do if the private sector does not want risk at scale in the global south? I'm not talking about India so much, but even there, they don't want it at scale. If the multilateral institutions have relatively little capital, really, what is the paid-in capital of the World Bank? $22 billion, okay? Joe Barata, who runs private equity at Blackstone, walked by a few minutes ago. His fund is $25 billion, his one fund, okay? Not his old funds, not other parts of the firm. This is the major institution of the world to deal with this challenge. We're way undersizing the capital needed to deal with this challenge, and it's not close.
Yeah.
So a lot there. One of the things that we're trying to do with our work at the Milken Institute is sort of unpack some of the key issues over the next decade. We're currently working, because I like alliteration, with 6 Ps: public finance, private finance, pipes. You talked about the MDB stuff, piping, and a couple more Ps.
You need a P in the MDB.
Yeah, we need that for sure. And then 2 other secret Ps to be named later. But I wanted to talk a little bit about public finance and then maybe come back to some of the piping and go to you, Adam, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy and Infrastructure at Treasury. You know, one climate eddy that we've had for a number of years has been cap and trade and regulatory systems in the U.S. that have kind of not quite gone and flowed as well as we would like. Here comes the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think has spurred a lot of activity, a lot of capital flow. Opine on it. Share with us an update.
Sure. And thank you for organizing this conversation and having me. So from our perspective, we think we're on track to make the single largest investment in energy security in the United States in our generation. So can go through some of the specifics of what we're seeing thus far, but maybe it's worth taking a little bit of a step back in terms of the approach, as you mentioned, with incentivizing private sector investment. So as many of you probably know, a lot of the ways in which we motivate investment through the Inflation Reduction Act is through tax incentives. And that's why the US Treasury has such a large role in the implementation of the act. And one of the things that we tried to do with the construction of the legislation was create longer-term tax credits, which as a former investor, we thought could help signal certainty and give people confidence to make investments in this area. And so we've written about 50 pieces of guidance to date. We're very focused on trying to implement as much of the act as possible. And I think we've seen some really encouraging results across 3 areas. So I think the first, just in terms of the private investment numbers, we've seen about $282 billion of private investment across the clean energy sector motivated by the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's across over 1,300 projects. And in addition to that, there's $120 billion that utilities have made in clean energy generation. And the second area that I might talk about is specifically in clean energy generation and how it's affecting some of our greenhouse gas emissions. I think we're seeing some pretty marked changes in how we generate electricity in the United States. By Department of Energy projections, wind is expected to triple by 2030. Solar is expected to increase by 7 to 8 times. And since President Biden took office, EV sales have tripled. So I think there's some really promising signs to see there, as well as I think in terms of our overall greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of talking about where we are, we project that we're going to be reducing our total emissions by 40% by 2030. So still have more work to do, but I think some promising initial work is being done. The final area that I also would like to point out in terms of the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, though, is related to the economic benefits of the IRA. In terms of, from our estimates, we're saving Americans something like $27 to $38 billion in their electricity savings in terms of what we're doing. Additionally, I think there's some really meaningful jobs being created where, according to our estimates, we see approximately 170,000 new jobs being created in these industries and approximately 1.5 million more being created. So there's a lot there, still a lot of work to do, but I think we've seen some early glimmers of progress.
Great, that's a great setup. And we're going to maybe come back on some of the international capital flow and copycat, if you will, in terms of more carrots, not stick policy that we're seeing out there. Here, I wanted to go to you next. Maybe put on your hat as a former asset manager running a $1.5 trillion Japanese government pension fund. What do you see as opportunities for capital investment out there? We talked recently about nature as an area that you're starting to think a lot more about. Share with us.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I used to run the Japanese government pension fund, which is $1.7 trillion.
Oh, it's up too? 200, sorry.
Well, I just grew it a little bit, but. And then, if you manage $1.7 trillion and forced to divest globally, you become the major shareholder of 8,000 companies, and you become the biggest owner of U.S. Treasury and all the other government bonds. And then in that position, what you can do to improve the climate impact of the portfolio? Actually, none. Because the fiduciary duty of those kind of things actually handcuffs me and they just limit what I can do. So I actually took the different approach by showing to the world what we expect by holding this globally diversified big portfolio. What's going to be the consequence of what kind of the pathway we are on. And we became the first big public pension fund to produce the TCFD compliant report, where we showed that our portfolio seems to be on a trajectory to 3.5 degree. Mm-hmm. And what I said is, if our portfolio is on the pathway to 3.5 degree, that's where the world is on. And I really didn't like the competition between asset owners saying that we divest this carbon-heavy industry and now my portfolio looks better. but the actual world is not changing. So actually it took the advantage of our universal ownership type of portfolio to show the world that's where we are heading into. And then I also, and after I retired from GPIF, I joined the UN as a special envoy to promote the sustainable investment and innovative finance. And I was involved in all those blended finance. And then where I found it's very difficult to scale up. And then I even took a part in the launching the G funds, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where the Mark Carney always boasts that the other, like 400 financial institutions joined and a total of a couple of $100 trillion committed to climate or like a net zero. And which on the surface is true, but in reality is, the only less than 10% of those money is allocated to the developing economy, where we need more money, of which the Mark mentioned about. So I've been thinking about what's really, dictating where the core of the capital is flowing into. And I came to the Mike theory, which is one is indexing or benchmarking practice of the industry. Because a lot of asset owners, even the banks, really uses the sort of like a benchmarking practice, such as like a S&P 500, MSCI, or World Index. And the other is the risk matrix. You really need to measure the risk to reshift the money. And then why the risk matrix doesn't exist, which incorporate these climate change, is that, first of all, there's no consistent disclosure framework. So my friend Jim Donfa is sitting there. He is now, we worked together when he was at the World Bank. I really pushed him hard to issue more green bond because their green bond issuance is too small for our portfolios. I pushed them hard. And then now he's actually promoting the International Sustainability Standard Board, right, to promote the sustainability disclosure. So once we have those kind of disclosure standard, we have a data. And we have a data, we need to have a risk matrix system to measure the risk. And then none of those really exists at the moment. So on that the theory, I joined the MSCI as a special advisor because MSCI is one of the key and the leading player for the indexing and also risk matrix data provider. But I really think we really need to change the indexing or like a benchmarking practice, a risk matrix, including the fair disclosure and a consistent disclosure. And the last one is we really need to change the rating mechanism, because the credit rating is really playing a key role how much money the big asset owner can shift. GPF used to be the biggest, probably one of the biggest clients of like a PIMCO and those people. And even those very, very reputable and very skilled fixed income manager, they usually allowed by their clients to invest up to 5 or 10% into non-investment grade opportunities. And by definition, all development countries, their investment rating is non-investment grade. So there's no way for them to shift the majority of their capital into those areas. So we really need to find a way to either detach credit rating from this kind of climate investment or urge those credit rating agencies to improve their rating mechanism. But without those, it's hard to shift the core of the market to address these climate changes.
Awesome. So, there'll be a quiz at the end if you're keeping score, if you want to do bingo. So we've got 4 Ps so far. We got the lack of an investable pipeline, piping reform we'll come back to, public finance, private finance, and now 3 Rs, risk, resilience, and rating. So a quiz will come, but I promised 2 more Ps. So I want to talk next with Amber Miller about people. The issue of talent, super important in this space. Diverse managers, local leadership, et cetera, to make more projects happen. I noticed, Dr. Miller, that your title as Dean of USC's, formerly Columbia Letters, Arts and Sciences, is sort of this very 19th century sounding school, but you're trying to move universities into the 22nd century with public exchange and other efforts to really bring practicum, et cetera, on the ground. So I wanted you to share about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you for having me. So one thing that has just struck me over the years, back when I was at Columbia and then coming here, is that our American research universities, I would argue, are the single most under-leveraged engine of innovation that we have in this country right now when it comes to solving the climate crisis. And the discussion about America's research universities has been mixed up completely with the rest of the world of higher education. And that world is on the front page for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with what we're talking about today. And that's most of what people are talking about and thinking about. And then when they're thinking about something other than political crises and protests and these kinds of things, they're just thinking about the educational mission, just undergraduates and graduate students coming to school and the workforce planning. To the extent that the research mission is really front and center at all, people really think of universities as engines of innovation way down in the pipeline of development. So way down into the development of the really basic science and engineering that someday, 50 years or 100 years from now, might end up creating something that is a bankable project or an actionable thing. But it's not what people are mostly focused on. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, when it comes to climate innovation, we have unbelievable stuff going on in our universities. We've got people building electric bacteria that could create batteries that would replace the need for critical minerals. We've got earth scientists figuring out how to speed up weathering of limestone so that we can decarbonize shipping just by replacing some shipping containers with some reactors and capturing all the carbon and storing it in an inert form. This stuff is amazing, but it's true that it takes a little while to get through the pipeline. But that connection between the development of those kinds of technologies and what's happening day to day in the world where people are on the front lines trying to solve this problem is really tenuous at best in most cases. And there's a ton of expertise that's left on the table when you think about the interaction with universities being, we university invent it here, and we push it out, and we put it in papers, and we put it in white papers, and we put it in conferences, and then someday down the road it gets picked up. So when I came to USC, one of my really serious focus areas was to figure out, how do we turn that around? How do we change the mode of engagement to say to our cities, to say to our counties, to say to our business communities, we are here as a resource. We have unbelievable experts in the area of environmental economics and behavioral psychology and decision science and spatial science, which is becoming a really big one when you couple it with AI. We are here, and we can help with projects that a city is working on, a county is working on, a business are working on. So we got going on this project about 5.5, 6 years ago. I hired one person, and she's sitting over there, Kate Weber, who became the executive director of our public exchange. And we built an entirely new vehicle for a university to make that kind of expertise available to partners outside the university. And then we said to everybody, this is discipline agnostic. We can work in any space. And what came in the door came in through two big channels. One, climate and sustainability, and one, health and wellness. So in the context of this conversation, the climate and sustainability arm now has its own special director, who is absolutely terrific. And we've really built out the ability to do things like urban greening, like provide expertise to help cities think about water conservation, to help the IPCC think about climate communication, to work in EV electrification, heat resiliency, all kinds of things. And we've worked now with cities in California and Arizona and the county of LA and others. And so, my message to all of you is, this is brand new. We can reproduce this at other universities. And when we do that, we're already talking to one, I won't tell you which one, but it's in a red state, which is really interesting. When we do that and we put this model out into a network around this country, nothing can stop us from leveraging all of that academic expertise in ways that are really directly applicable to the kinds of problems we're trying to solve and to the development of bankable projects. And so that's where that really connects.
And I'm going to want to come back to you on kind of our local success story round on more detail on some of that. I wanted to invite in next Hero to talk a little bit about business school education within the people talent thing. Put a quarter in you to go on that. And then Mark, we had talked a little bit about whether Ally Timon or some other examples there, and then I'll kick it to Helen to start talking about the nature issue, and then move to Adam from there. But Hiro, the business school education, when we were doing the panel prep call, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, well, no offense to academics, but the academics are usually very nice people and very genuine, but the problem of the management of the business school, they really have to think about their own management before teaching students how to manage business.
That's why they should look at how we manage our school first.
So I recently, after I retired from the public pension fund, I joined the 4 major business schools, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, and Kellogg, trying to just push their finance faculty to integrate all these climate change and ESG into their curriculum. And then they almost, consistently, the dean agreed that's necessary, but the finance faculty pushed me back, saying it's not theory. Okay, so I had a conversation with all those finance faculty, but everybody has the same, the counter argument saying there's no financial theory that they can teach to its students. And I keep saying, well, there's no theory. And they said, there's no research. Well, there's no research. They said they don't have the data. Data is available, but they said it's too expensive. Okay, I'll make it free. So recently I agreed with the MSCI through their new Sustainability Institute. We are providing ESG climate data, which the MSCI is selling for good profit, the free to the academic researchers. Because we need them to research on the financial impact of ESG and climate. And without that, we continuously reproducing young professionals which are not educated on the importance of the climate change in the finance. And then same applies to the CFA Institute. I'm also on the advisory board of the CFA Institute, where on one hand, the CFA Institute produce a lot of the ESG researches, but when it comes to their charter qualification exam, there's not even a page on the ESG or climate on their textbook. So there's a lot of gaps that the educational institutions are not picking up. So after 3 years of the effort, I finally decided to publicly criticize the laziness of the business school by contributing op-eds to Financial Times that they are really need to update their curriculum. And then we just need to break the vicious circle of no research, no teaching, and then we continuously teach the wrong theory, climate and ESG are not a part of finance, to all the young, the professionals, which is wrong. So that's one thing I'm pushing, and I really appreciate everybody raise their voices, because we need them to educate the young people in the right direction.
That was nice and spicy. Mark, you want to throw in here a little bit before I go to Helen?
I guess macro and then micro. From a macro point of view, I think the comments around technology and the advancement of technology are really right. There's been huge progress. The comments around the positive nature of the IRA. The IRA has also driven decision-making around the world, which wasn't fully anticipated. The Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians have all instituted programs that are also driving. The challenge is the scale. And I just want to take one more second on this. Are we going to emit more carbon this year in 2024 than last year, or less? So we're in a transition. Will we get more? We'll be more. Okay, so we're still going up. And it's 60 billion gross tons. Okay, it's very hard to get your head around what that means, but we're supposed to be 0 by 2050. It's very, very, it's very, very hard to see anything other than flatlining for quite a while. And so we have to figure out, what do we do about that at scale? If the United States, which is absolutely a key leader in this, as are some other countries, including Japan, including China, if we go the wrong direction in the next couple of years, it's like another 4 years of lost effort. Yeah. It's just really, really. Okay, so on the macro, on the micro, like what are people doing? There's a lot of really great action in this room and on this panel. At 3 Karens, we have 3 major things that we're focused on: money, markets, and talent. Money, markets, talent. The money is around establishing funds in India, Southeast Asia, Africa, Caribbean, Central America. where its junior capital is from wealthy people, the first $25, and then the rest is mostly governments and private actors to invest in the first dollar of a project. So the highest risk of a project is the early stage development risk. Each of these funds is around $200 to $250 million, and that's relatively small to the scale, but the first few million bucks can drive a lot. And if it works, which we think it will, then the MDBs are coming right behind us, the multilateral development banks, or with us, not behind us, with us, and the private sector does as well. So you get a multiple opportunity for growth. On carbon markets, they don't work well on the voluntary side. So with Bloomberg, we're trying to establish the accounting for carbon. Right now, if you trade something in carbon, it's not audited. If I buy a credit from you in the voluntary carbon market, do I put it on my balance sheet? No. I put it in my ESG statement because no auditor audits the trade. That you cannot scale something that's not audited in finance. It's like, it's inconceivable, okay? The third is around talent. It's just connecting people to projects. If you have a project anywhere on the continent of Africa and you don't have the right engineer or the right financial marketer or modeler, then we'll find that person for you, hire the person, price the person, vet the person, and then as long as you're willing to pay a reasonable price, you can have the person. And so we're trying to do that, which is a market that exists in the OECD markets in many levels, but doesn't exist to energy and climate in most of the southern part of the world.
Awesome. So another underinvested and underdiscussed area that since wildfires and forest fires have become net emitters in many cases rather than carbon sinks is nature and adaptation. And wanted to go to Helen to share. I know ClimateWorks is working with a number of foundations to really lead the charge in kind of making this a bigger issue, as well as co-investment opportunities between mitigation and adaptation.
Thanks very much, Dan, and really do want to build on, I think, what both Mark and Hiro have emphasized, just that while we are making progress in some areas, we're off track, and the really big barrier at the moment is going to be finance. And this year for the climate negotiations is all about finance. And we know we're facing a much more difficult public perspective on finance, tightening fiscal spaces, possibly lowering ODA, and climate finance is definitely going to see that. So how we can leverage private investment is going to be critical. How we can sort of build capital stacks that might include a bit from philanthropy, from public sector, and then private is going to be really critical. And an extreme area of this is on adaptation and nature. Nature could be about a third of the solution set in terms of how to reduce emissions or capture emissions, and yet traditionally has seen about 3 to 7% of climate finance. So really nowhere near the scale it needs. It is also an incredibly important investment in terms of helping us to adapt to the changing climate we're seeing, helping us to manage when we have heat waves, when we have flood events, to actually stop these impacting infrastructure, towns, cities, the people who live there. So there is a lot of both benefits for adaptation and for mitigation from investing in nature. And there's more beyond that we need to do in terms of building our resilience as communities and adapting to climate impacts. And one example is just the heat waves we're seeing around the world and the impacts of those in places like India and countries like Africa. I mean, in Arizona in the US, I mean, the impacts of these are enormous. Japan's been hit, others have been hit, and it's going to be coming with more frequency. So the funders that we work with at ClimateWorks, we really help support all of climate philanthropy to do more, to invest more in climate and better and more collaboratively and more people-centered. And one of the things we've done is brought together some funders, or a few funders who are investing in adaptation and resilience. Over the last couple of years, more have come out of the woodwork and said, oh, we might be interested. We started a process about a year ago now with just a few in a room. We now have almost 50 funders philanthropists who are interested in really investing in adaptation and resilience, who see this as something which can be done alongside to enhance, to strengthen what we're doing on mitigation, on reducing emissions, and something that is just absolutely essential to meet the crisis that we're now facing on climate. So it's really shifted, came together in Dubai at the climate conference in December, signed a call to action to work together to get more funds shifted, primarily in the Global South, as Mark pointed out. I mean, that is the real challenge we have, and Hero, that's where the funds are needed, and that's not where the funds are going. So really excited that we're able to move that forward and to really pilot test approaches where philanthropic capital can be catalytic and really help to move towards the solutions we need in the Global South to address and manage the risks, bring these down, protect people from heat, from wildfires, from storm events.
Thanks. I was going to go to Adam, but Amber looked at me. I think you want to talk a little bit about how do you tackle these multi-decade changes in the brain, or do you want to talk about something
No,
else?
I just wanted to jump in quickly on some of these nature-based solutions in the urban context.
Yeah.
So, we have worked we have one project right now, we're working with the city and the LA Parks and the Army Corps of Engineers and a bunch of academics thinking about how do you use an augmented virtual reality system to try to accelerate the project from an idea of how to transform the LA River so that it affects the floodplain and makes it a better environment for people and creates urban greening and all of these other things, and gets through the permitting process and the community engagement process and all of those things. And it turns out that you can put that all together through the public exchange framework in a really clear and easy way, the same way we did the urban greening project that we did with the city of LA that's now expanding. And I think those kinds of models, when you start with one urban environment and then you take that model and you push it out, can help a lot of urban environments learn how to get there much more quickly. So it doesn't say we shouldn't be working in the Global South. Obviously we should be, but we can also be thinking about how to accelerate this process within our big cities.
Awesome. So Adam, to you, there's a panoply of things you could pick from. You might want to talk a little bit about the prepare work the administration is doing. You may want to go to G20, but dive on in, sir.
Yeah. So we'll try to pick up on a couple of the threads and focus it more on our international rather than domestic efforts. But in terms of prepare, we have a whole of government approach towards adaptation, in which we're working across over 19 agencies to focus on people in developing economies, the 500 million that are really affected by these. And so can pick a couple of ways in which we're doing some of that work. I think the first is there's been a lot of discussion about the multilateral development banks. And one of the things that we've really been pushing on is how can we evolve institutions like the World Bank to be better suited to respond to some of these challenges. And so part of that is just the capital needed for some of these challenges. So we've been pushing something around a capital adequacy framework review, which is just having the multilateral development banks think differently about their balance sheet. And just from that work, we think over the next 10 years, we're unlocking another $200 billion. So not nearly enough, but at least making some forward progress in that area, as well as getting them to reorient around what are the targets as well as incentives for making investments in these areas, because a lot of that comes from just what you're measured against. I think the second area that I would point to is some of the work that we're doing within the G20. So I co-chair our Sustainable Finance Working Group, and this is where we work across the G20 on some of these issues. At least two maybe worth highlighting very quickly. I think a lot of people have talked about we need more resources, but I think one of the things we're also looking at is, can we do a review of just how can we use the existing resources more efficiently across the climate finance architecture? Because there's a ton of funds out there, the multilateral funds, there's private investors, there's the MDBs, but I think no one is in agreement that we're perfectly optimized in terms of how we use those resources, particularly concessional resources, and can we actually have real theory of the case on what can change. And in many ways, we're modeling this work after what kicked off MDB evolution in the G20. So we think there's some real promise for what we can do in this area. I think a second area, just picking up on the last discussion, we are thinking about financing instruments for nature-based solutions. I think there's some really good work happening in the G20, would welcome inputs on that. And I think in particular, I find the concept of natural capital accounting very interesting in terms of, can you actually value some of these things, which I think just flows through, as many of you said, into the underlying investments that are needed to be made. The final thing I'll say is we're finally very focused on private capital mobilization. I think the multilateral development banks in particular have been thinking about what tools can they use to motivate private investment. Just this year, they announced the launch of a guarantee platform where they're trying to streamline and broaden a lot of the guarantees they provide to the private sector. And we expect their guarantees will triple by, I believe, 2030, which we're pretty encouraged by. And we're also continuing to look for innovative ways in which they can also tap capital markets in terms of financing some of this. So I think some of you may be familiar with the originate to share model. I think also there's this new climate investment fund capital markets mechanism where we're just trying to think through all the different innovative ways in which we can bring more resources to bear on these problems. I think the last thing I'll just say is we do think there's a very important role for pensions, endowments, institutional investors to play. And I think that's why we're incredibly excited to be here, talk to some of the people here, and also have groups like the Investor Leadership Network, where we're really trying to think through what are the steps that we can take that can unlock those big pools of capital into some of these areas of need.
And we're great to have everyone here. Let me just, I'll go to you next, Mark, but just a couple pieces of context. One, now it's gone, but QR code, last chance to get in questions in the next 5 minutes. I'm going to do another round with the panel. The other thing that we're doing with all of the climate financed events, both public and private, that we're having here is we're putting together essentially a slide deck that we're going to share in draft with a community that we're building. And if folks are interested with bringing their ideas and input, how many P's we can stick and how many R's to help organize this thing, because I think we've seen a lot of times the cocktail party chatter of how do we unlock sideline capital. You have to really get into the weeds. So while we're bouncing around at times with this conversation, we're also using this to inform what we want to put on the table and think about and stage over the next decade. Mark, you wanted to get in?
I guess I agree with everything Adam said, but I want to also put it in context. So 200 billion, I'm on the World Bank Private Sector Investment Lab, so I spent a lot of time on the World Bank and on MDB reform. The 200 billion is a huge number, and if the Biden administration had not changed out the head of the World Bank, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Yeah. So there's a lot of positives in what's being said. Mm-hmm. On the other side of it is it's 200 billion over 10 years, right? So that's straight line at 20 billion for everything that the World Bank does. Let's make it up on a generous day. It's a third to climate. So that's 6 billion. 6 billion, 2.5 trillion. Okay, 6 billion, 2.5 trillion. That's a year. Okay, that's needed. Okay, and if you just think of, it's important to have context on where are we in relationship to the need. The world spent about 20 trillion. The U.S. spent close to 20 trillion on COVID. 20 trillion. Not billion. We spent about 6.5 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, not billion. And there's a return on invested capital to the spending that we're currently doing related to climate. You get a return because you don't face the kind of numbers that Helen was talking about at the beginning of this conversation, which is an overwhelming disruption to capitalism. It's just very hard to see capitalism operating on a supply chain basis the way we think it's going to operate and has operated for years in the same structure that we currently have. Lastly, I spent a short time in the Biden administration at the State Department. For 4 years under President Trump, the word climate was not allowed to be used by the State Department. You could not say the word climate if you went to, it's very hard to imagine how diametrically opposed this is to progress around this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm trying to think which P to play around with next, either pipes or pricing.
I touch politics, so you don't have
Well, yeah, we got that, exactly. That also should be added to your game board. Let me throw something out on pricing. So, right now it seems like seems to be an emerging consensus that we're going to have to take a 10% pie slice of carbon out of the atmosphere by 2050 to make our numbers. Right now, I think we're subsidizing in the U.S. $50, and this is an important thing to figure out, to be clear. Pricing $500 to $1,000 a ton, and yet for nature-based solutions, it's hard times if you don't deliver $40 when you promise $30. Any thoughts from anyone in terms of how to build risk-adjusted returns or to use that carbon removal price as kind of an anchor for rethinking the system, whether it's voluntary or mandatory?
One thing I would say, just to jump in, is I'm all about finance, as you might be able to tell, but actually it's policy that has the biggest lever. And so if you're able to put a carbon border adjustment, for example, you do get reaction at scale. You know, you really can get reaction at scale, and that is driven by politics, not by finance.
Helen?
I might add on to Mark's comment. We used to do a lot of work on, you know, can you get there on environment and climate through sort of voluntary first movers in industry, and Japan's been great on trying to get first movers going ahead. And the whole plan was that you'd have this wonderful virtuous cycle where you have some first mover companies go out on a limb, do something ambitious that convinces government that actually the rest of the industry can do it. So it cycles back to a regulatory environment, which brings all the rest of industry along on where you need to go on climate. Then you've got everyone along, and then you get some more first mover industries moving ahead. So there's this wonderful virtuous cycle of corporate leadership from some, government coming in, regulating. Then that leads to more corporate leadership trying to get ahead of the game. And somewhere along the line, we kind of forgot the part about government policies, I think, in a number of areas. And I think carbon markets is one where we've had a real push on voluntary carbon markets and fantastic work. We support also, Mark, on how do you get the actual rules and regulations and the data, the information right to make these work. But we've kind of forgotten that really these are meant to be a step towards the regulated market. And what we need is governments to actually come in and help with that. So I think there is a lot that we need to continue to do on these to actually get the markets to work on a voluntary basis, but also look towards regulated. In this country, you can't really talk much about carbon taxes and carbon prices, although we do have them in a number of states. But it's a different picture globally, and I think we need to bring that to the fore. We now have, I think, 70 countries worldwide, which includes Mexico, it includes Singapore, Japan, Korea, EU, but South Africa, many more, who are doing some form of carbon pricing, either tradable permits or direct carbon taxes. And in last year alone, across those, they saw $98 billion in tax revenues or proceeds from them. So, I mean, we're looking for money. That's not all that we need. Mark, everyone, Adam will tell us that's not all that we need. But there are opportunities there which can help to ensure the polluters are paying and actually move it forward. And I'll talk more about subsidies if you give me an opportunity. We can talk about those.
I want to quickly go to Adam. You can pick up on the pricing or the VCM if you want. Also, just work in another fun one from the audience. Would the work on the G20 not benefit from more representation by African countries beyond just the African Union when there's such great investment needed on the continent? Boom.
Yeah, so can start with, I think, the discussion on carbon markets. I think this is an area that personally, as well as within the building, we're increasingly focused on. And I say carbon markets, both in terms of compliance and voluntary. But I think we've noticed some of the challenges in voluntary carbon markets recently, and just the need for real credibility in these, particularly on both supply and demand side. And so we're exploring ways in which we might be able to address some of these issues and promote more integrity in some of these markets. And would say a lot of this work actually, and I'll segue to the G20 question, is happening in a global context, not just in terms of what we do. I'm a native Californian, so I appreciate some of the compliance markets we have here, but also internationally in terms of some of the work we do, in which the G20 actually in June is going to be discussing the interactions between voluntary and compliance markets. So I think that really gets to some of your, the broader push on the panel. And I also think that we're bilaterally working with a number of countries as they set up a number of their markets and trying to make sure that they're doing this in a way that we see as both credible. I think Brazil also is doing some interesting work in this space. With respect to the G20, I think we're trying to make a number of efforts to make the G20 more inclusive. It's our presidency and right after the South Africans. So I think that's definitely something we'll take to heart. I would just note that the African Union is invited to represent, which is, we're trying to make various efforts to include more people from the African continent, but very much appreciate the push on the question. But you can speak with the Brazilians as well.
2 point I would like to make is I still believe in the power of the capital market and power of free market. They will figure out what's right for the society and the world. But the problem is without the policy guardrails, they will probably wait a lot of time trying, until they really figure out what's right for the world. So we really need to put the more pressure on the policy negotiator at the COP29 this time, because last time at the Dubai, which I found it interesting, is if you read the list of the achievement announced by the president of the COP UAE, majority of those actually private sector initiative.
Yeah.
So very little progress on the real policy negotiation. So it's good to have the private sector trying to bring in more and more initiative, trying to be proactive, but we really need to make sure that the policy negotiation is happening.
Yep.
And the second is a carbon credit. I think it's very important because that's probably the only way if we can really change the equation of how the market reacts at the moment. And then I really don't believe that the regulator or anything can really regulate that kind of market. We need the private sector participant to come up with the market pricing, but we need to have one stick to the ground so that everybody can work. At the moment, everything is fragile. Everything is so fluid. So I think that anybody like a U.S. Treasury or some of those the government can really actively participate in setting even just a carbon budget will promote the private sector thinking and the acting and trying to arbitrage, and those kind of things will always result in a bigger market.
Now here comes your tee up, Helen. So one of our P's is public finance, and we've been playing around with our slides that we'll be sharing out for anyone who's interested. The limited pie chart of public sector money for loss and damage, for adaptation, for de-risking, the stuff that makes market happen. And half of that pie chart is what, Helen?
It's going in exactly the wrong direction. It's $1.5 trillion globally, which in 2022 went to help subsidize fossil fuel production and consumption. $1.5 trillion. So Mark has mentioned the numbers that we need to help move on renewable energy, on the clean solutions, and globally we are still subsidizing fossil fuels to that tune. It was an extraordinary year. It's when Russia invaded Ukraine. A lot of governments were panicked and were thinking, how are we going to get the energy supply that we need? At the end of the year, we found out that oil and gas companies made record profits. So I think the governments were largely duped, and had we actually invested more of that money in some of the clean solutions and renewables and battery technology and developing strong, secure pipelines of critical minerals, we'd be in a very different space now. So this is, I think, the time we have to call it quits. We have to move away from that kind of subsidy to fossil fuel producers and consumers that's going directly against all of the climate commitments all the governments and private sector have made, and move that away and start using that as investments in the clean.
Amber, I wanted to go to you next. We had a question about the importance of cultural solutions in driving some change. I wanted to broaden it out even a little bit more. I know that you've been doing some work with behavioral scientists to, how do we deal with multi-decade challenges? We're sort of a frog boiling ourselves in some sense. Do you have any take on that? The other thing I wanted to point across the hall from us right now, we're releasing results from the Harris poll, a study of business leaders and consumers around climate resilient infrastructure, and the one area where they all come together as around more locally based solutions, the kind of thing that you and others have been investing in, but also around this idea of long-termism, but how to make humans think long-term. You figured it out for us, Doctor?
Yeah, it's just in the book outside. I think that's the, $60 million, whatever the number is, question. I mean, I think, when we did a hard look early on at USC to think about where could we as a university take all of our intellectual capital and build an initiative that was different from what other universities were doing. And I talked to a whole bunch of people, and one of the areas that we really focused in on was what I ended up sort of dubbing our Human Factors and Sustainability Initiative, which was really all about just trying to understand, yes, we have the technology, yes, we have the scientific background. Why is so much of that sitting on a shelf and not being implemented? And, when you start digging out, your environmental economists and your behavioral psychologists and starting to talk to people and say, okay, so why is conservation so difficult? Why is climate communication so difficult? And it turns out that there's some just really fundamental misunderstandings. I mean, we did a study where we had some of our behavioral psychologists do a survey, and this was working for the UN Foundation, to try to understand just basic climate communication, climate terms. So turns out, they talked to people about the terms like adaptation and mitigation, and people would say, yes, we understand those terms, right? Yes.
Oh, good.
And so, okay, great. So what does adaptation mean? And people would say, in the context of, climate communication, well, it means when you take a book and you make it into a movie, right? So it means they're reading this thing, but their heads are not in it, right? And it was a very similar, mitigation. Oh, well, it's like when you sue somebody. Well, right, but that's not, your head again goes to a different place.
Right, and the other finding in our poll was that business leaders overwhelmingly know they need to invest more in resilience, but haven't yet. So we're going to have to dig in with that next. I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to do the classic lightning round of 52 seconds for everyone. You can raise your hand when you're ready. The last thing I want to say is the person who wrote that wants to do less fragmented, more partnership. Come see me after. Like what we're trying to do at the Milken Institute is with pension funds and other investors that we have, how we can assemble and lean into and bring what we've got to the table. We certainly don't have all the answers. So lightning round. Do I have an initial volunteer? Adam.
Anything? Or just what struck?
Yeah, this is the one. Thank you. We talked about it in panel prep. The one big initiative that you think over the next decade that needs more attention that we can work on.
I mean, to be honest, it was actually carbon markets, and what we could do. So maybe another area I think that is interesting and emerging is we were talking a lot about how to make more coherent investments in the global south. I think there is a growing discussion around country platforms that's happening in the G20 that I think is worth unpacking. But the basic idea is how do you increase and aggregate the amount of public, private, philanthropic financing to really help ambitious countries transition from fossils to renewables. And I think there's some really good work in a number of ways that's being explored on how to do that I think is worth lifting up.
I'm not just going to come this way. Helen?
I'm actually going to take up the partnerships one because I think that is right. And I think as we look at what we need to do on finance, we've had far too long where governments or MDBs are just sort of putting their own money into solutions and not using that public finance strategically to actually leverage partnerships with private finance, bring in a lot more from the private side, or they've been just putting their money going the wrong direction, right? The fossil fuel subsidies. So those partnerships, and I think that is essential. Mark described it like how you can do that at big scale. But I also want to say we need it in everything, including small scale. And one example, very briefly, that excites me right now is something we're seeing which nobody ever thought would be possible. It's adaptation and resilience in India for women who are working on the streets. They're selling goods, they're farmers, etc., who are impacted by heat. And you would think there's really nothing you could do here but public money. But there's this unusual combination of climate resilience for all, Swiss Re, a local Indian insurer, and coming together really to find solutions. And with SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, they've just launched something which has 50,000 women in. They're going for 3 million, where they get insurance, parametric, dropped into their accounts or onto their phones so they don't have to go out where there's a day of extreme heat. And it's something that is a model. They've already tested it. Now they're going big. And it's something that can work. So that's somewhere where you're getting that private investment. You're getting the insurance, private insurers in, and doing some public. But I mean, that is the example that you would think you could never get private investment, and you can.
Hero, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think I agree with Adams that we need the carbon market because to come up with the carbon pricing. Because I think if you ask all the CIO attending Milken conference, 99% minimum of them says today's the valuation of their portfolio is not reflecting the climate risk and opportunities. And then the best way to do that is to come up with the carbon pricing. And then to come up with a carbon pricing, we need to have a market around it, unless the government just make it a carbon taxation. So I really think the carbon pricing caused by produced by the carbon market is going to be a very real game changer.
Amber?
I'll lean into the partnerships, but I'll take it up a level and say multi-sector, new ideas coming from one sector into others more often and in a more concerted way.
Mark, the last lightning word.
Risk. We have to rethink risk. Mm-hmm. The world is at risk.
Yep.
When price stability is the Fed's requirement, one of its two legs, you have to think about what will price stability look like in the kind of world that was described. Not good. It won't be good. So you have to just think about what is risk. Equity leads all things, not debt. We need more equity in certain markets that we do not have it for. And the precious water of equity can be stacked if properly deployed.
Awesome. I want to thank everyone on the panel. Thank the audience for participating. And again, have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.